The next 3 sessions are all about the same topic, but 3 different ways of looking at it. The topic is open peer review, and I'm taking a very broad definition of open peer review. It's a topic that I'm highlighting for you because I see it as an emerging topic, one that is probably going to get a lot more discussion as journals that are peers and competitors of yours might implement open peer review. Quite a few journals in the HighWire group have already implemented open peer review in one or more of their titles. So I thought this would be a good time to look at what's motivating this, what is the research, and Bernd will talk some about at ASAP Bio meeting that was focused on this topic. Next we'll look at what is the research on open peer review, and Sara Shroter has agreed to give a presentation about summarizing the research on it, and then experiences with it from those who have actually done open peer review. Bernd?
Oh, okay. Great.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. So I try to keep this very short. There are several of you in the room who were at this meeting too, like Theo, so do chip in or correct what I say wrong. So this was about the ASA Bio meeting that happened in February in Chevy Chase. ASA Bio is actually a community-based organization. It comes out of the biosciences that really came out of a commentary that Ron Vale, who's a biologist at UCSF, wrote about 3-4 years ago about what's broken in the peer review system, and they just thought to do something about it, as they like to do in California, which is great, and actually came to and convened this meeting at Howard Hughes to about 3 years ago, which really resulted in the launch of preprints in biology. So this is a great example, I think, of a really bottom-up thing. A few people come together, and actually a lot of energies just sort of coalesced, and suddenly it was very clear to the funders in the room that this was something really big, and that they managed to get the preprints off the ground fairly efficiently. So bioarchives already existed, but it really was catalyzed by that. So it's a great sort of paradigm for running meetings, which we don't do very well in Europe, I think. They basically get together, it's an invitation-only meeting, about 100 people, but they take quite a lot of care to get all the stakeholders in, but also users. So they always get young scientists in at every career stage, not just senior people. They get the industry representatives in, and also funders in. And it's a very small group. They work on the basis of short talks, and then spin out groups that discuss things they heard in the talks. Then they report back into the whole group, and they're trying to come to some conclusions at the end of it. This time, this was actually the second ASA Bio meeting in February. Really was post hoc after the first one concluded really in that preprints are must-have in biology, and since they happened, they decided that actually their remit had sort of been exhausted, but they still had funding. So what can we do next? And they really focused back again in on peer review as a core topic that they actually started out with. So what was different about this group was it was again a small group, but they actually added at the very end some spin-out sessions where they really tried to lobby some publishers to take on specific projects. So that was semi-effective. I will give you a couple of examples from that. So and you can see Theo there actually at the front, sitting there in the front, so as evidence that you are actually there. There's also very eager-looking Richard Sever there on the bottom left. So what happened at this meeting? So I can't really move forward, right? Okay. So this was opened by Erin O'Shea, who's the director of Howard Hughes. As you know, this is a small but extremely wealthy funder in the United States that can really change how things happen, because they fund a lot of the really top-level research in the US. She threw up this slide to get the meeting going. So she basically talked about corrupting incentives, lack of transparency, accountability, a huge amount of waste of resources and time in the publishing process, and limited access. So basically the starting point was the whole thing is broken, and we need to either get rid of it or really improve it very dramatically. And these are some of the main outcomes. Preprints are here to stay, that's a no-brainer now, but we've sorted them. They, at this point already, the CZI had started to fund bioarchives, so there was no more real need to focus on that, so let's move on. So let's move on to think about how preprints can be recognized more formally as research outputs by funders, and it's great to have funders in the room. You can really put them on the spot there and say what are you going to do about it. So citations to preprints, formal citations, were seen to be a crucial thing that has to happen, and I think that's already happening now, so that's great. And the funders were not really very clear on how they would start to embed it in their research assessment processes. But as you know, a bunch of funders also in the UK have now become much more progressive at this point, and actually specifically not just allow but also invite people to cite preprints in their applications. So that is actually changing very rapidly. Now, problems with peer review were very clearly articulated, in particular also at the level of sort of gunk that ends up in biological papers, and there was one very powerful presentation from one of the directors of the NIH saying statistics in our biology papers is absolutely outrageously bad, which I can fully agree with. So that's something that we haven't really managed to deal with yet. There was quite a lot of discussion about how much quality control to add to preprints, and again this came out of the medical, particularly the medical space, and we already heard about what came out of that because we have med bioarchives now, so that's really also happening very rapidly, and this is partially informed by these discussions. Then there was thinking about how to interact between journals and preprints, interaction with preprints, but not just journals and preprints, but community and preprints. And this really resulted in some of these overlay concepts, and I give you a couple of examples of that just now. And then totally new refereeing peer review models. Okay, so one of the things that was discussed was the quality control of preprints, and I think with Met Archives, we have one example that was already explained in great detail. PLOS is now also feeding, as was already mentioned by John, all their papers into bioarchives, and I think that's very important because they apply their quality control checks before it's fed into bioarchives. So actually the PLOS bioarchives papers, which will be tagged separately, have already undergone the PLOS quality control screen. So we are very keen to do this too at EMBO, but we don't have. For us, it's a scalability problem. It's actually very, very hard because it's an order of magnitude more quality control that we can't finance right now. Then we already talked about some of these things, so I go super fast. There was a lot of enthusiasm for the pre-lights concept, and that's already up and running now. This only happened in February, this meeting, and here we are, so this is very impressive. But really one of the key outcomes of this meeting was a massive endorsement of the various initiatives to do journal club at the level of preprints. And this is actually, on the top left you can see a slide Martin Schalfi uses now in all of his talks. He's one of the Nobel Prize winners in biology, and he does all of his journal clubs now only on preprints, and they post all the comments they make in the journal club formally on preprints. The other person up there is Harold Warmes on the left photograph, who actually started this even earlier than Schalfi. So this is really becoming very successful, and there's an initiative called Pre-Review at the bottom left here that does this in a much more formal way. So this is a very exciting way to make preprints much more useful, I think. There was some feedback, some data, and overall it was reported out from the attendees, but this one thing that has to be said is these meetings are all very small but also completely public, so everything is streamed and recorded so people can vote on things publicly. So they do these questionnaires at the meeting, and basically there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the peer review system as we have it. And there was a call from a bunch of people, but in particular Ron Vale, that we have to include younger people more in the peer review process. That's a crucial thing that has to change. There was a lot of questions about getting enough training for peer review, or a huge lack of training in peer review, and there was a call for getting more formal credit, academic credit for peer review. Not financial credit, there was also a general feeling there could be financial credit for it, but the overriding interest was really in getting academic credit for it, so that it makes a difference in your own research career. And there was a sense that, let me go on to this, there was a sense that journals need to transfer referee reports between journals, that these things have to be more open. and there was a lot of discussion about how open they should be, and I think you hear from Theo what really open peer review can look like, but I think the outcome was that, that minimally all journals going forward should have open peer review reports. So that means the reports have to be open, but they don't necessarily have to be signed. They should be citable, they should have DOIs, and there should be proper records associated with the paper, but not necessarily signed. And there was actually a complete consensus by everyone at the meeting that this should be community standard now going forward. That was probably the main outcome. The result of this is an open letter that ASA Bio released now, which you're all invited to sign if you haven't signed it yet. It's a very, very short letter. I'm not going to read it out, but it basically says transparency is important, and we should all have open referee reports going forward. That's all it says, to make it signable for everyone. They kept it quite low key. Sorry, I'm just going very slow on this. Okay, so now about, so I mentioned the journal clubs as an output. Now what about experiments with peer review at and beyond the journals? One thing that was strongly discussed was overlay journals, and they've already been mentioned several times today. There was a specific proposal from Mike Eisen, who you probably all know as a prolific blogger and activist who ran for the Senate actually recently in the United States. He's going to launch a Praise, which is basically a peer review system that picks out interesting preprints and has them classically peer reviewed, basically. His aim is to replace journals entirely. He thinks there's no more place for journals. He basically, also as a historical note, he mentioned how the open access movement all began when he went down to the original HighWire offices in Palo Alto and talked to John Sack, apparently. So I'm quoting here from the talk. And wanted to have the whole literature downloaded on his floppy disk, basically, at the time. And John refused because there was access control, which Mike Eisen had never understood, had never conceptualized as an issue in sharing information. So he was so upset by that, he launched the open access movement. It's all your fault. There was a very concrete proposal by Ron Vale. Sorry, I forgot the credit. That's his slide. He basically felt that this is animated, I think. So he basically felt we have to move peer review studies is going very slow. I think I have to move. Can you move it forward one slide? It seems to be stuck a little bit. Maybe the batteries is stuck. Okay, yeah, so, and you can advance it further to save time. Basically, Ron wants to move peer review into the preprint space and away from the journals. According to him, he does not want to replace journals or destroy them, but he thinks journals should, could you keep advancing? He feels journals should, the role of journals should be to basically disseminate information, comment on information, and host information, rather than doing the primary assessment of the work. There was a proposal that was actually one of these lobby sessions where he called in a bunch of publishers and was pretty much roundly shot down actually in this effort. However, there's a few aspects of this which are really very, very interesting, and we're certainly interested to keep discussing this. This is actually not doing any better. Could you just manually advance, please? No, next. And this was a proposal by Erin O'Shea, which was the other most dramatic proposal, to essentially to do two things: to start having tags on journals that clearly describe quality aspects of the journals, such as openness, transparency, and so on. I think everyone was in agreement that this will be a good thing as long as it's standardized and becomes meaningful. And in fact, funders in Europe are now thinking about using some of these attributes to classify what is a more desirable journal for a funder and less desirable journals. So this is something that is happening quite fast and is an interesting component. This is my last slide. But the more dramatic proposal for them was to essentially, and if you keep going, I think this is animated, if you keep going, to replace the publisher, the editor, with the author. So the author is now self-assessing the referee reports and decides when they post their paper in a given journal. Now this was, of course, sort of flabbergasting. I was just sitting there going, holy cow, this is pretty amazing. And I think most publishers felt that. But actually, Elif, if you keep going, Elif has decided that this is a very interesting thing. They think the checks and balances in the system are, of course, that the reports have to be public. They're associated with the paper. So it's all out in the open. So if you as an author play games or decide to publish a flawed paper, it will be all visible to everyone out there. If you keep going to the next, let's keep going because time's up. Keep going to the last one. So you're going back. Oh, okay, and this is the Elif experiment. That's my last slide. They basically just launched this a couple of days ago. So they're doing 300 papers in the plant sciences where they basically do exactly what I just talked about. They're getting the authors themselves to decide if they want to publish. The only thing they're doing is they're adding an editorial statement under the abstract that says either all the issues have been addressed, minor issues remain unresolved, or major issues remain unresolved. So Elif may publish papers that say, we really didn't want to publish that paper, but we had to. So that's the end. This was something that is turning into an experiment, but there was some pretty interesting proposals at the meeting. Anything to add, Theo, to that?
At the end of the presentations on open peer review, put all the information out there and then wrap up. So Sara Shroter is our next speaker. I'll just anecdotally, when we first started HighWire, we came up with this term we called evidence-based publishing, that it was a great idea to have data to support the decisions you were making. And somewhere like 1998, when we started working with BMJ, I discovered that there was actually a researcher in BMJ who was producing the evidence. And so right away, I became best friends with Sara and have admired her work for years. So it's great to have you do this, this research data summary. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Okay, so John's asked me to summarize the evidence of what we know and what we don't know about open peer review. Confessions, actually, John, it wasn't me that you met back in 1998. I have been here a very long time, but this is actually research that predates me being here for 17 years. So a lot of what I'm talking about is studies that others have done at the journal, not my own stuff, but I'm going to give you an overview. I'm also going to just briefly talk about the BMJ's experience of having done open peer review for so long and other experiments that are going on elsewhere, and what we don't know still. So what do we actually know about peer review? We know lots of things that aren't so good. It's inconsistent, unreliable, unfair, expensive, biased, causes delay, it's poor at detecting errors, and it's pretty useless at detecting fraud. You'll have all be familiar with all of those, I'm sure. So what do we know in terms of evidence about peer review? Before we even move on to does open peer review work, what about peer review itself? And actually it's very difficult to evaluate peer review. It has a varying definition dependent on which journal you're talking about, which organisation, within funders, journals, publishers, so much variation that it can be very difficult to actually put all the information together to actually say if something does or doesn't work. There's actually no agreement even on its objectives. So is it about improving the quality of papers? Is it just about giving opinions? What is it? So until we define that, it can be very difficult to pull all the evidence together. There's a lack of validated outcome measures. How do you evaluate if it's working? Well, the main outcome measures seems to be review quality, as measured by the review quality instrument, which again predates me, so that's back in the late 1990s when this was developed. And I haven't seen anything better since. So this is a validated tool that does actually measure review quality, and it has a global score at the end, but it seems to be fairly robust psychometrically, so it does the job. But how else do you measure it? Is it about picking up errors, or is it about the time taken? And there are a definite lack of measures out there. A lot of the studies that have been done in peer review are very small, and they're actually not generalizable necessarily beyond the journal that it was done in. And again, when I talk about some of the BMJ studies, you'll probably be sitting there saying, well, actually, wouldn't be like that in my journal, and we recognize this. So there's very weak evidence, and very, very few RCTs have actually been done to test whether it's working or not. Now, I'm not going to go through this whole slide, but basically, I've been fortunate that Ross I don't even know how to pronounce his surname, I'm sure someone can do it better, he did a systematic review last year of what open peer review actually means, and there are 122 definitions out there. We've heard quite a few over the last 2 days, but he's summed it up down to 7 key traits. So I'm just going to focus on the first 2 really today. And that is open identities, about authors and reviewers knowing each other's identities, and open reports, where the reports are published alongside the actual article. I'll just leave that there a moment so you can see the other definitions. So, what are the arguments in favour of open review? And there are actually a lot, and this probably is not exhaustive, but I've created a list here. So there's a lack of proof actually that blinding and anonymity work. We assume they work, and we say that this is for the good of research, but we don't actually have hard evidence that it's particularly good at improving the quality of review or improving error detection or whatever our outcome measure is. Anonymity doesn't solve the problem of power abuse. So people think if it's blind, therefore these nasty behaviours won't go on, but actually it does nothing to stop them. Often blinding doesn't work. People are very aware of whose paper they're reviewing anyway. I'm not going to go through every single point, but of course there's the importance of transparency, accountability, it being a fairer system, reviewers getting the credit for the work that they've done. They normally do this behind the scenes, and people don't know who's reviewed whose paper, and junior researchers could be doing lots of peer reviews and their supervisor wouldn't even be aware. So open review can be very good for giving them credit. It's about engaging the wider community, so not just the peer reviewers that have done it, but people can also respond online and increase that engagement and improve the science. You can become aware of conflicts of interest that aren't immediately available or people aren't aware of when peer reviewing the articles. So the more people looking at the page, the better. It's less wasteful. By being open, you can either be encouraged to write a much better quality review and spend more time doing it, or you might just behave as you would anyway. But there's a big argument that you might be encouraged to behave better and to write better quality reviews. But what's the evidence of this? So we've actually proven that open review is feasible in practice. As John said, lots of journals are now doing it. We've been doing it for over 20 years, I think in year 2000, so 18 years of open review at the BMJ. Lots of other journals are doing it. You don't tend to hear about too many adverse effects of it. Adrian will be talking about BMJ Open. I don't know what he's going to say, maybe he'll say the opposite. So we kind of do the BMJ, at the BMJ do open peer review because we believe it's ethically superior, and we've also based this on our trial evidence. So arguments for blinding are pretty much the opposite of what we've just said. So the main argument is to reduce publication bias about gender, institution, language, those sort of things. But what's the evidence that it really does work? It's fairly weak evidence. So reviewers are protected from angry authors. This can be a benefit. Junior researchers can feel stronger about complaining about the quality of papers. They can be freely critical without worrying about repercussions. It can be faster because you don't have to tone your review as carefully as you might if you were signing it. And you apparently, people think that there'll be a lower refusal rate. Again, apparently, we'll see about the evidence. And editors don't have to actually be publicly accountable for any of it. So that can be a positive. Most of the arguments for blinding tend to be based on just a sense that it can't really do any harm. So now just moving on to the BMJ's journey of how we got to open peer review. So I'm just going to only very, very briefly flash up the details of this trial. You don't want to know all the details, I'm sure, but these were a series of trials on a substantial number of papers, adequately powered to show an effect. Most of the trials have used review quality as the instrument. As I mentioned it before, it's a validated instrument. And they've all been published so you can follow up and find them. So The first trial was whether blinding reviewers to authors' identities or revealing the reviewers' identities to a co-reviewer, unmasking, whether that would affect review quality. And blinding and masking had no editorially significant effects. It might have a slight statistical effect, but editorially none, on quality of peer review, reviewers' recommendations, or the time taken to review. So what about if you blind reviewers to authors' identities and then require them to sign their reports, and whether this improves review quality? So again, another trial, various arms, and this one looked at the number of weaknesses within the paper that were detected. Neither blinding or agreeing had effects on error detection. That was the primary outcome. Blinded reviewers had less likely to recommend rejection, and the mean number of errors spotted was just 2 out of 8, which is pretty appalling, and we've repeated that within other studies. We did a trial, which I was doing, on the effects of training peer reviewers, and they were detecting just 3 out of 9 major errors within a trial, which is quite worrying. So moving on to actual open review, we tested whether revealing the reviewer's identity to the authors affected review quality. Again, with the RQI is the review quality instrument, and the time taken and the recommendation, and they also did an author survey to find out views. No important effects on review quality, recommendation, or the time taken to review. But there was significantly, reviewers were more likely to decline the invitation to review. So this has been widely cited as, if you do open review, reviewers won't want to review. And I've heard this endlessly, but just bear in mind this was a trial done in 1998. It's somewhat out of date, that we've evolved in processes. It was also a trial. People that take part in a trial behave very differently from everybody else. So it doesn't mean that when you transfer this back into real life that you're going to get a high refusal rate. And actually, just while we're on the subject, to show that when BMJ actually launched open review, we haven't had a problem with refusal rates at all. We're very lucky that we're a huge journal with a huge number of potential reviewers, but people don't come back to us and say, oh, we don't like your open process. So based on this trial, we introduced the signing of reviews, so back in 2000. The next trial was to see whether telling reviewers that their signed reviews might be posted on the BMJ website would affect their review quality. And again, no difference in terms of review quality. There was a high refusal rate, again, amongst potential reviewers. And it did increase the time taken to review. But again, I would say it increases the time taken to review. They know they're taking part in a study. They don't want to look silly when they're doing this. Doesn't mean that it's going to affect their everyday reviewing behaviour. So BMJ now publishes the reviews online on bmj.com, and we've been doing that since 2014 only, despite the fact the study was published in 2010 and was actually done a very long time ago. And there were lots of reasons why, and it was mainly to do with technology and having to manually upload those reviews. But you'll see now when you look at any BMJ paper, you'll see there's the tab highlighted in yellow, peer review, where you'll see all of the pre-publication history for each research paper. And also highlighted there, you can see that you can rapidly respond to articles once they've been published, so you can carry on the dialogue about the papers once they're there. And we find probably on average about two rapid responses per research paper. I think Theo can say more, but I think there's roughly about 2. So that was just the BMJ story of where we've got to. But since then, and that was pretty much all done before year 2000. So since then, back just in 2016, there was a systematic review of the evidence on open peer review. So in this systematic review, they included 7 trials, and they weren't all ours. There were others going on in very different journals. And they pulled all the data together to see whether open review was improving the quality of review. And sure enough, if you look at the bottom diamond, that's the collated effect across all the trials, and it shows that it did result in a higher review quality. And again, just looking at the bottom diamond, it's on the left-hand side. This shows that the effect was it lowered the rejection rate. So open review lowers the rejection rate. And again, looking at time spent, And the bottom diamond, you can see that it actually crosses the line. There's no difference in the time taken to review. So that's, state-of-the-art evidence, a systematic review on what we know, 7 RCTs. So looking at blinded review, you can see that that didn't affect review quality rate or rejection. If you want a lighter version of the evidence, go to Hilda Bastian's blogs. They're very nicely written and they sum up the evidence. The links are all there if you want to pull them up. So that was the trial evidence, what we know. What about the observational studies and what are they showing? So I've just listed a couple here. And the first one is about a retrospective analysis of the quality of reports operating in different models. And this was done with BMC journals. And they found that open peer review reports were leading to higher improved quality of reviews than the single blind reports. So observational studies are supporting what the trials were saying. Another study by Sally Hopewell was about the impact of peer reviews on the reporting quality of trials. Again, looking at the BMC journals because they are open and you can see all the reviews. And they failed to detect important errors within the trials themselves. And while some of the comments had positive effects, some of them were very negative and could have been inappropriate. So would they actually have had the same effect if they'd looked at different journals? So these were Biomed Central journals, which aren't necessarily the most high impact journals. Did the effect differ? What would be the effect have been on clinical impact if you've only just focused on the trial reporting? I'm not going to go into the details here. There's a couple of big surveys. There are others on what researchers think. And just to comment about the quality of the evidence on the surveys is that they're often pretty small response rates, sometimes quite highly selective groups, and you often just see percentages reported of what people think. Surveys tell you some things, but they don't really tell you how people are going to behave in reality. Are they going to do what they say they're going to do? But generally, quite a positive approach to the idea of open peer review. But going back to the fact that open peer review has so many varied definitions, are we all talking about the same thing? Now, I said I was going to talk about the first two of the 7 traits brought up in the systematic review, but here's another one on open participation. So Nature did an experiment looking at open participation as a complement to the peer review process. But this wasn't a success at all, and they had a small number of authors who were willing to take part, a small number of overall comments that were received, and the comments that were received weren't very substantial. So they pulled that approach. Another one was atmospheric chemistry and physics, and again, not a success. Only 1 in 5 papers was actually commented on, and a content analysis comparing that with peer review reports was that they weren't very substantial. So the idea is that it's not really replacing peer review, but it's potentially acting as a good complement. So back to the BMJ, as I said, we've had a pretty positive experience with it. We definitely have no regrets in moving to open review. We haven't got everything perfect. We're not saying, there's always going to be situations that arise that can be tricky. There's one there where a peer reviewer was was named despite the fact the paper was rejected and was pretty much bullied over it. But we don't have many issues like this. Having been here for a long time and knowing that we had a yellow card system where we would log all these things if they arose, they just don't tend to get reported to us, so we assume they're not happening massively. We're definitely not suffering from a high refusal rate. But do authors know about keeping people, the peer review process being confidential after we do tell them, but with it all being open, they might sort of feel that then therefore it's still open, but it's not once your paper's rejected because it's no longer ours to dictate. We don't own And I just want to throw this one in, which is a completely innovative approach that the BMJ has been doing for the last couple of years, where we ask patients to review articles alongside the peer review. So they're not acting as peer reviewers, they're acting as patient reviewers. And they are doing this in an open system. We're asking them to sign their reviews just like we do all our reviewers. And actually, we thought this could be really problematic and the patients wouldn't want this information to be out there, that that person is associated with that disease, that condition. But when I ran a survey last year, we had very high engagement with the reviewers, and only a very, very tiny proportion were concerned about actually behaving in an open world and open reviewing. And even then, they were still signing up and doing it, but they had their specific concerns. So it tends to just be if there's a very, very personal topic that they're reviewing that they worry about this. But we did explain exactly what open peer review meant, because of course this can be quite difficult to explain to those who aren't familiar with it. But patient review has been a huge success in the sense that we've managed to implement it within the journal process, and patients are enjoying the opportunity to comment on science. So here's another journal, the European Journal of Neuroscience, who were worried about implementing open peer review but just bit the bullet and did it. And actually none of their concerns that they had before starting turned out to be true at all. So a very positive experience reported there. That's in an editorial that you can all see. So what do we know? We know that evaluation is definitely difficult with many forms of peer review and very varied journal practices, as I outlined at the beginning. Arguments for or against are often based on faith rather than actual data. Blinding is often ineffective. There's lots of studies that show it hasn't worked. Sort of 30–40% are succeeding in identifying who's reviewing their papers. I've touched on what people say they will do isn't necessarily what they do in practice, so we have to be careful about just responding to what people say in surveys. Very few studies or experiments are underway they're beginning as ideas of experiments, but I'm not sure about the quality of the actual experiments and the collection of the data on the newer types of open peer review, and I hope that they will be collected rigorously and be written up as research projects if they are meeting those standards, because at the moment there's nothing in the literature about the effectiveness of these. So we do know that there's some evidence from the trials and from observational studies and from journal experiences that open review is actually improving review quality. And there's no evidence that it's having a negative impact on review quality for the open reports when we've got them publishing them online at the same time with the article. We also know that it's feasible in practice to do open peer review, which is probably why we're seeing more and more journals beginning to adopt it. And what don't we know? Well, there's a lot we don't know, because if you think about, I've just touched on just a few little things at the top of the definitions of open peer review. We need much better evidence about the conclusions on the effects of blinding on bias. How do the effects of open review vary across disciplines? A lot of these studies are done in a single journal or a single discipline, and this can have an effect. A small journal will always say, well, we can't implement open review because all our journal reviewers know each other and they're not happy to do this. But we need more testing to know if that is true. We need some rigorous experiments on the newer versions of open review. So open peer review is definitely an evolving phenomenon, and we've seen it in its different forms for the last 2 days. The attitudes to it are changing, a bit like open access when that was first launched. There was a lot of fear that people wouldn't be able to, they wouldn't like it, it wouldn't happen. But it is changing, and we need to keep track of it and evaluate what's happening in terms of performance on journal articles. We need more journals to experiment across different disciplines. And also, a careful evaluation within practice, and some studies are very old, and we need to be able to see if we can replicate them. So the peer review trials that I talked about in the late 90s, the landscape has definitely shifted, and it would be good to see some other experiments to confirm these ideas in different disciplines. There are other initiatives going on, like the Open Up initiative, which is encouraging publishers and researchers to team together to share data and to try and solve some of these bigger questions. Thank you.